For this example here, we have two houses that have side slopes going into a swell that's following the property line. So you can see the orange stake up front there where the property line has been staked out. The subdivision that we're doing for Mount Tabor has the swell going in between the building setback and the property line. So here's where I'm showing is that the water is going from a high point in the middle of the houses there out to the front drive and to the sidewalk. And so that's basically what we're doing is we're carrying the water from that high point out to the right-of-way driveway intersection in the plan view as shown here. So our high point here for this lot, 322, is that 7.6. And then we're going to push the water from that high point that's in the middle of the lot to the front where the right-of-way and driveway meet. And then we're also going to push the water out to the back. And because we don't have that slope is a downward slope from the house. And then here I'm just showing that there are going to be slopes going from the house to that swell. I want to go ahead and also add in just a few contours into here. And these are just going to be very rough contours showing the flow, how that's all carrying around the house there. And with these contours, you can think of them just as horizontal slices in the terrain is how we're depicting these. And they'll be more evident once we add in the surface from the driveways and the surface from the side lot swells. That we will go ahead and trace those out there. But this is sort of how it's looking here, is that it's coming up from the road, going into that swell, defining what that needs to look like via topo lines or topographic lines. And again, these are not exact lines. These are just being sketched in. So our next example, we've got a high point in the very back of the lot. And so we're going to push the water from that high point in the back of the lot to the front, and then there's a swell in the back that follows a wall that you can see with that rail back there. Again, just depicting here how the drainage is going away from the house. These are about 2 to 5% slopes, or 2 to 5% grades coming from the house. And so from that high point, the water's gonna tip back into the back there, and then it's gonna tip up via the swell again to the driveway sidewalk corner. I think in this subdivision here, the right-of-way was very close to the sidewalk, so that's how it's working there. In the back of the house on the right is a wing wall, and then on the front of the house is a porch. And generally, if we had a flat lot, these would be at grade. But with this, because of the street having some significant slope to it, we have what's called turndowns or subwalls that go into the houses to help step down the grades in between the lots as it goes down the road. So from the finished floor elevation, we measure down to the proposed grade and either determine whether it's going to be a turndown or subwall. For this client here, a turndown is 2.5 feet and lower, and a subwall is 2.5 feet and greater. So with the wing wall back here, basically that is to extend that rear yard. So there's a porch or some type of slab out in the back of the house that wing wall helps to keep that ground level for a little bit so that they can go ahead and have a flat area for that porch or slab that they have back out there. With the front, that porch will just wrap around and eventually that grade will tie into the driveway. So again, just drawing in some contours into here. And again, these are not exact. They're more just a rough representation of what the ground looks like and what's going to be drawn on the CAD plan. So again, that's rear to front drainage. And then what I'm doing here is just showing that the contours, obviously it's a wall to a building. The contours are still going up that. We generally don't show the contours that once they hit the wall. We don't show those unless it helps with our surface modeling. Sometimes we'll use break lines or something to go ahead and make that work instead. So for this one here, 253, 252, 254, these are basement lots. And so we'll have a high point up at the front of the lot where the water will break to the street and the water will break to the rear of the house. So you can tell that here from that high point, there's going to be a slope about 8 feet, and then it'll flatten out. And from that high point, I'm looking at the road here. 252 is higher than 253, so I did draw that correctly, that water will flow in that direction. Because 252 is at 1096.4, and then 253 is at 1093.6. And so looking at 253, 254, I have a thought that this water will most likely just dump into the back of the lots. I think that's a pond or a creek back there. But sometimes what will happen is they'll put a drop inlet, say for example, at the rear of the lot, 254, 253, and they'll put an inlet back there to make that water go into the inlet instead of having it fall off onto a slope, a rear slope. Here I'm just sketching in what the contours are going to look like going in between the buildings when we do have a basement lot or adjoining basement lots. And we have that front contour that just sort of wraps around. It doesn't connect to the lower lot. There's sort of a hill that is shaped off of that 253 porch that goes down. We'll see an example here in a moment, real life example in a moment. And again, these contours here, I know with my sketching ability, it does look curved. I do try to make it so that the lines are perpendicular to the walls because we want to have obtuse angles coming off of the walls and not acute angles, because if those contours were acute going into, say, the 253, that would mean that the water is being pushed up against that wall. So we want to always make sure that the angle of the line of the grade comes off of the wall at an obtuse angle. So here we just have a front picture of a couple basement lots. And so we have that high point in between the two houses, and that water will go into the back there. Obviously it won't jump over that hill, but it will go ahead and drain to the back and follow the ground that way. And we have the water will come off the driveway, water will come off a point off the house there. And as we put the contours in, we've got that little hill that comes off of the garage. And if we extended that out, it would follow the house going around. But when we draw these in, we don't, at least at the house there, we don't continue the contour around the house. We just dead end it into the house in a perpendicular fashion. And here I'm just finishing out the contours. Here's another example. We've got a turn down / subwall coming off the finished floor. And we'll go ahead and put in, on the plan view, we will put some type of dimension of how high that turn down or subwall will be. This one looks like maybe like a 2-foot turn down. And then we have the drainage, of course, coming off of the house. And this does look like it's a midpoint where they're pushing the water to the rear of the house and then also to the front of the house. And again, it is at the property line. You can see the property line stake up front there and then also in the rear for these. And this is just the houses were so tight together, you couldn't shift the swell close to the house. It needed to go down the property line. Zooming in on a rear view of the basement lots, we've got that high point there, and then we have a wing wall coming off just to go ahead and keep that dirt away from the rear of the house so that we could go ahead and have a nice flat backyard there. Again, just showing, hey, this is the yard going out there, that we try to keep that like a 15-foot away from the house at a 3 to 5% drop going from the rear house out to the back. And here, just giving the examples of what the contours would look like. Again, on the plan view, we won't draw the contours coming around the house. I'm just drawing that more just to give the example of this is what happens to the contours. This here, the contours coming off of the left-hand side of the house and sort of wrapping around a hill. And then there's a ditch sort of in the back. And then that swell in between those basement lots and the houses in the foreground here. In between all that is that pretty big swell that they've created back there. And that water is going to flow from that high point in between those two basement lots and down to the left. And then we'll have a swell coming from upstream going into that area as well. And I think it's one more example. This is a basement lot. I think all three of these are basement lots, but this is a pretty extreme road. I think this is at like a 15% grade, and so it's pretty steep. And so we'll have a lot of elevation change or step down between the lots, the house finished floor elevations and the garage elevations. So I'm just sketching in here how the flow of water will look with this here, and kind of sketch in what the contours are going to look like. So they're going to come from like the rear of the house and follow. We got a little wall holding up that porch, and that wall actually extends out, and they've extended out with some landscape rock there. And again, that contour is going to cross the driveway and just hit the wall, and then it's going to follow that building out. But again, we're not going to draw those contours once they hit the building. We can pretty much end those where they're at. And just showing where that brick wall is ending, but as I look at it a little bit closer, that is actually extended out with those rocks a little bit more. And the rocks act sort of like a wing wall. And again, got a little bit of swell from that high point in between those two houses that is bringing that water from that high point to where the driveway and right-of-way, driveway and sidewalk meet, being the low point right there. And just sketching out how this would look if we were doing the roads and what the contours would look like. And so those contours do follow the gutter uphill. And then it hits the gutter and goes out into the street. I do want to point out the upstream or up the road, there is the house here that has a wing wall also on it. That porch is wrapped, or I should say that porch is on the other side of the section of the building. So the porch isn't supported by that wall. That wall is actually just coming out from the house. And it's not bricked or anything like that. But it does look like, yeah, they build the wall and then they step down the foundation a little bit. It's kind of a weird situation.